Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, August the 18th. And today we're going to catch up with our good friend, Professor Carlos Eire. We've had Carlos on the show many times on the audio as the video. We're going to talk a little bit about Venezuela and what's going on down there and get his thoughts on that very difficult story down in Venezuela. And then we'll do our usual Cuba update. I'm anxious to know from Carlos what he believes could be the influence, let's say a collapse of Maduro and what influence that would have on Cuba. So we'll get into that topic in a few minutes. But first of all, let me say hello and welcome to our dear friend, Professor Carlos Eire. Welcome, Carlos.
It's always good to be with you, Silvio.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Every time I talk to you, we're of the same generation, maybe a couple of years, but you know, the experience we all went through, having been in Cuba in those early years of what they call La Revolucion, you know, and this was brought back to me a little bit here in the last 48 hours when the Vice President Harris was talking about price control.
Oh, geez. Yes.
All of a sudden, I said to myself, I think that I've seen this movie before. In fact, I have a post that will come out today in Babalu about that, saying, hey, we saw this movie before. It didn't end well.
Yep. And not only that, you know, it's come up again in Cuba because they have this fake self-employed business model where they have so-called entrepreneurs who open their own businesses, and they're supposed to be, you know, capitalists, but they're not. They're completely hamstrung by government controls, fees, fines, this or that. So they've imposed price controls on them. And within the first 48 hours, they fined so many of these so-called entrepreneurs for not sticking to the price controls. They collected millions of, well, I don't know if they'll collect, but they impose millions of dollars of fines on these so-called entrepreneurs, right? And they're basically, you know, this is another way of driving them out of business. It doesn't work.
It does not work. And one of the things that most people do not understand is that it would be completely unenforceable in an economy like this. You would have to, you know, they would have to literally take over industries and run industries completely, because they don't seem to understand. You know, people or many people like Vice President Harris, they think that it's all in whatever the price of, let's say, the can of beans is at the local bodega. But there's so many other things that happen and so many other actions that happen before that can of beans gets to the local bodega that you would have to intervene in every one of those steps.
That's right.
And it would just be unmanageable. You know, they don't, government by its nature doesn't work that way. It doesn't have the people to do that. And it would throw the economy in chaos. And as I mentioned in my post that should be coming out Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening over at Babalu, what I remember from my mother, and we left in 64. That was a little bit after you left, I know. But in 1964, what I remember was that my mother was going down to La Bodega and, you know, La Cola, La Famosa Cola, and standing in line to wait for this week's ration or the next. That's what, in essence, that kind of price controls did for the Cuban economy. Something never happened before. There was no rationing of goods before. So,
and you know, it also a black market always exists in a highly controlled economy. If you add price controls, you know, to a free market economy like the United States, you instantly create a black market. It's and that's another way in which it's uncontrollable. So I remember Nixon, 1970s, imposed price controls here in the United States, and it was just a total disaster.
Yeah, that was in 71. It didn't last very long though, because well, it was so unlike for a conservative Republican like Nixon to do that, that he got very bad reception from everybody, and he eventually shut it down. But of course, Nixon, when he did his price control, I think it was like a 90-day plan or something. It still didn't work, but at least he had a beginning and an ending to what he wanted to do. What Vice President Harris is suggesting is you're going to arbitrarily say, hey, you're charging too much. And then the other thing too, and again, this is what reminded me of Cuba, was when they keep talking about profits and they do not understand, you can make billions of dollars in profits, but not necessarily be a profitable company, because it's all about return on investment.
Right.
It's, exactly how profitable are you, not the profits. They go after the oil companies. Well, the oil companies are very big, so that's why they make big profits. But that doesn't mean that their return on investment, as financial people like to say, is really big. So this is really a bad idea. But when VP Harris brought it up, the first thing that came to my mind was my mother standing in La Cola, La Bodega, over by La Bodega, that was over on the other corner where we used to live. And it just brought me back to that. I don't know if you had the same reaction, Carlos.
Oh, yeah. Oh, of course. I left in 1962. I stood in line many times, sometimes as a placeholder. My mom would say, you stand in line here till I get back, or something like that, right? But no,
there was a lot of that. I had a brother, so we took turns.
So I know what standing in line is all about. But ultimately, what it is, I've never taken an economics course, right? So I'm not very well read on economic theory and so on, but I know that there's a law of supply and demand, right? And if you choke off the supply and there's still a demand, that means that whatever the object is, it just becomes more expensive.
Right. No, you're exactly right, and that's all you have to know about economics. You don't have to take a lot of courses. I do have a memory. You being a professor, you'll appreciate this little story. My very first economics class, I took several courses in economics, but my very first one, the professor was a Korean professor, Dr. Jin, I remember, Kim, a very, very nice man, very smart. And one day we're talking about inflation. And I raised my hand, and I say, Professor Kim, a lot of us get confused with inflation, exactly what it is and how high is it. And he looked at me, and so then I asked, how do I know what the real inflation rate is? And he looked at me and he said, ask your mother. And I said, my mother? And she said, doesn't she do the shopping at your house? That's the one who really knows what the inflation is, because she is coming every week in contact with, food, the food she's buying.
Right.
So she knows how expensive it is this week versus the week before. So I thought you would enjoy that story about economics and a professor who told me to, talk to my mother if I wanted to know the real value of inflation. I thought that was very profound of that professor. You being a professor might appreciate.
Yeah,
that.
well, that's one of the oldest tricks in education is kind of shoot the question back at the questioner.
Well, he shot it back, but I tell you, he had an impression on me.
Well, that's it. That's how you learn. That's how that's what causes you to learn what's going on.
Right.
But eventually, in a place like the United States, you impose price controls. We're not going to get to a barter economy. But that's what happened in Cuba with price controls, is that money became worth less than objects that people wanted. So people started trading things.
That's exactly right.
And actually, my father was a judge in Cuba.
I remember, somebody would say, here's un paquete de papas, I'll trade it for this.
Yes,
I remember that in our home.
Yeah, but it's
probably
illegal.
Got worse after we left.
It's illegal, right? So one of the very, very few, because, my father stayed behind and never got to leave. So I didn't know what was going on. But a reader of my memoir Waiting for Snow in Havana, wrote me an email after reading the book. And she told me the most amazing story. She said, I have to tell you this. Your father saved me from prison because I sold my ration of meat to someone on the black market. And I was going to get something like 10 years in prison for selling my meat to somebody. And your dad rescued me.
Well, that's a great story. I have another story, not exactly like that, but I remember as a kid, maybe in the last 3 or 4 months before we left Cuba, that my parents and several neighbors were like inside the house, all the windows were closed. And that's because they were splitting this piece of beef between the neighbors that they had probably bought in the black market.
Yeah.
So one of the neighbors, a very funny man, passed away recently, but he was the one. He was born in Isla Canaria, so everybody would call him El Isleño. That's what everybody would call him. And everybody's in there counting the beef, and then he decides to play a trick on all of us, and he knocks on the door very secretly. And my mom said, "Oh, Dios mío, el comité," and everybody starts throwing beef everywhere, and hiding the beef any way they can.
Yes.
And of course, it was all a big joke, but that's what life was like.
Yeah.
For many of us.
I also have an uncle who stayed and never left. And then he got to visit me here in the United States like 3 times because he worked for the Ministry of Culture. But he told me a story that illustrates how these highly controlled economies work and how you eventually revert to a barter system. And his job was to help create art galleries for Cuban artists to sell their art to tourists. So he would be told, go to this building and you fix it up. Here, we'll give you 6 gallons of paint to freshen it up. And here's the story he told me that it just illustrates so beautifully, so perfectly, actually so horribly, what happens when the government controls all exchange. He said, okay, I get 6 gallons of paint and I have so many square feet. Within the first few hours, 3 people walk in and say, where's my gallon? Because of corruption. Where's my gallon? So he has to give somebody a gallon. He said, and by the end of the day, I'm left with 2 gallons. And then I say to myself, where's my gallon? So at the end of the day, he has to paint the entire gallery with only 1 gallon of paint because it's the stuff that replaces the money.
Right. Well, also the other thing too that happens in that system is corruption.
Yeah.
Corruption of the highest levels.
Yes.
Because everybody is, you got to protect yourself, so you have to be corrupt. Well, let's talk a little bit about Venezuela. You and I, of course, post at Babalu, and there's been a lot of articles about Venezuela. Where it stands right now is that the people are out in the streets again. They're marching in huge numbers, not just in Venezuela, but around the world. Of course, it's not difficult to march around the world against Maduro, but it is in Venezuela. My thinking, Carlos, and I'd like to get yours, my thinking is that his days are counted, that I really do believe Maduro will eventually have to leave. I hope he goes to Panama, where I believe he's been offered asylum. I certainly hope he takes that option and gets out in at least a peaceful way. So I'm anxious to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I'm not so optimistic because he has Cuba and Nicaragua. I call them the equivalent of the Bermuda Triangle, except this is the disaster triangle. Cuba and Nicaragua are helping him out. Cuba more than Nicaragua, but Russia is also involved, very deeply involved. The Chinese are also involved. So 20 so-called free nations plus the entire European Union have accused him of cheating and have asked for proof that he actually won the election. They're not actually asking him to stand down, but said, show us the money, basically. Show us that. Is he going to? Not as long as Russia and China and Cuba, especially, are backing him up. What is anyone going to do to remove him from office? That's where, no one's going to march in with an army. He has the army in his pocket. And actually, as one of our constant commentators on Babalu, Asombra, has pointed out, if there's anybody who could remove Maduro from office, it would be the military. So maybe that's the key to removing him, is to convince the military, because they're already all corrupt, to convince them that they will be better off without him.
Well, that's exactly right. I agree with you. I think that now they can be persuaded, I guess, in different ways. They can be told, look, if you shoot people, if you kill people, if you engage in that, we're going to hold you accountable. But the problem that I see is that I don't believe, and I know this is going to sound very partisan, but I don't believe that they fear President Biden. And I think that that's what you need. You have to be able to speak to these people and say, look, if you engage in killing your own people, we're going to act against you, and just kind of leave it at that and let them guess what you're planning to do. So that's how I see. I don't think they fear anybody. And then on top of that, they have Lopez Obrador of Mexico, who's the biggest, I don't know how to describe him. And, he's in their corner, which gives him a lot of credibility, because the position of Lopez Obrador is, well, it's their country, let them count the votes. And, that makes sense to a lot of people, Carlos.
Yeah, but I'm a little sketchy on the details, but the opposition did something remarkable in that they got printed copies of the vote returns, or high 80% of the vote returns, and they have proof of the cheating that took place, and they have proof also that the opposition won by an overwhelming margin. But that's not going to force him from office. And it's a sham. Everybody knows it's a sham. And ultimately, it all comes to, is any nation on earth, or any sort of group of nations, willing to use force against the Venezuelan army to get him out of power? And that's where I think no one would be willing to do that. And especially with Joe Biden as president of the United States, he is pretty much a ghost, right? He's a ghost. Who knows who's really in control in the White House right now.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that, and that's it. In a way, I don't think the American public, and that's another thing that helps Maduro. I don't think the American public is in a mood for the United States to intervene.
No,
because I think most Americans would say, hey, that's not our problem. And there is some truth to that. I mean, if you stand back for a second and you put yourself in the minds of, let's say, the soldiers or the parents of some of these soldiers, what's in it for us? I mean, we go in and we change the government, so good. But then they call us imperialistic if we do that. So it is. I mean, ideally, the change would come, the pressure would come from Latin America and from the European Union, but that's probably not going to be enough. But I am hopeful. I am hopeful that the heads of the military maybe will get the message that this is going to keep going, these marches, and that eventually they'll say, you know what, they'll encourage him to leave. Maybe maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's what I'm thinking.
Well, the only thing that makes me slightly optimistic is the fact that so many thousands of Venezuelans have hit the streets and they're not being killed.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Well, we've got today, I saw the figure over 2,000 in prison since the election for challenging the election. 2,000. That's a lot. But at least they're not killing people the way that happens in countries like Iran when there are demonstrations. You hear about, hundreds being killed. Or in Cuba, the July 11th sudden demonstration, nobody got killed that I know of. No, yeah, one guy got shot. I think one person got shot, documented. But there are now like 1,100 people in prison in Cuba. It has a much smaller population than Venezuela.
Yeah. Well, it's just a remarkable situation, the way the people have stood up, and you have to applaud it. I know that here in Texas there were quite a few cities where Venezuelans were marching, and you just feel for them, because we kind of went through a similar experience, except that the Soviets got in too quickly, if you know what I mean. So Castro was protected way too early. He never had to go through this. He never had to go through this kind of an experience where he had elections where the opposition could win. Yeah, they did have elections, but it was all staged, communist 1 versus communist 2. It wasn't real elections.
Yeah.
So, I'm optimistic. I really would like to see a change, and that kind of leads me to my next point, because I think a change in Venezuela, Carlos, would have an impact on Cuba. I really believe that.
Oh, definitely. They've been shipping oil constantly, less than they used to do, but they're still shipping oil, and so is AMLO in Mexico. Without oil, the Cuban economy, not just the economy, the country would just come to a complete standstill. As it is, they can barely keep the electric power stations generating electricity, and they have constant blackouts, and they need oil. They're all fueled by petroleum. So if Venezuela can no longer supply free or highly discounted petroleum, they might still have Mexico and Russia. Russia has been shipping oil too, but it would be a very, very severe blow. Probably a kind of severe blow that they would not be able to recover from.
Right. By the way, speaking of Cuba, I noticed you have an article today about El Hotel La Unión or La Unión in Havana. Now, I don't remember that hotel. I remember El Nacional, El Riviera, El Hilton, but I don't remember that one. Do you remember that one?
No, I don't. But, I left when I was 11. But the thing is, you have to remember that before 1959, Cuba was a very hot tourist destination. So there were all kinds of hotels. And not just hotels, there were a lot of very, very, let's call them posh hotels for the clientele. At this hotel that I posted about today, La Unión, among its guests, they counted the Spanish writer Garcia Lorca in 1930. A lot of Americans and Europeans stayed at La Unión, and I dug up some ancient postcards, and it was beautiful. And now it's called, what in Cuba and other Latin American countries gets called a cuarteria, which is, you take a building or a house and you put entire families in just one room. And they all have to share whatever bathrooms there are and so on and so forth. And it just turns instantly into a slum. And that's what it's been for decades.
Right. Remember that scene? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no,
Yeah.
go ahead. I was.
And probably a hotel that, I was going to ask you if you remember when you were talking about the Cuarteria, if you remember in the movie Dr. Zhivago, when he comes back from the
Yes,
war and he goes
yes,
into, and they're all mansion. And now the family that owned it was like living in a room, and there are 10 other
right.
families there. And I remember watching that scene with my parents when Dr. Zhivago was finally shown on TV. This is before VCRs. We had to actually watch movies
Oh
on
yeah,
TV, if you remember. And I remember watching that movie with my parents, and my parents said, "Igualito que Cuba, igualito que
right.
Cuba." The same,
Yes,
where everybody would live in one place.
yes. And actually, it's not just Cuba. It's every communist country was like this. I met a Hungarian in 1986, one of the very first Hungarian historians to be allowed to come to the United States. And he told me a horror story about his son. His son got divorced, but there was no place for anybody to go. So his ex-wife, his ex-wife's new husband, and his new wife all had to live in the same apartment. It's hell
Yes.
on earth.
Welcome to equity, right?
Yes. Yeah. Uh, there are many things that link all the former communist nations to us Cubans.
Yes,
I'm
I
sure you've
know.
had that experience. You meet an Eastern European and immediately, somebody who was a satellite nation, and immediately you bond with them because it's the same thing.
Right. Well, the one thing that I found when I was talking to some Russians, this is about 30 years ago, the one thing that I found is that they had their own version of the comité.
That's
It
right.
wasn't quite called the committee. I mean, it wasn't called the same thing, but it was the same thing.
Yeah.
And when they started talking about it, I said, well, I know about that. We used to have that in every street. And the head of the committee or the comité was usually somebody they brought in from the outside. They never actually gave it to somebody, at least in my experience. And but yeah, this is a common thing and it's all repression. That's what they all have in common: tremendous repression. And
Repression.
they put this fear in people that they don't talk, they don't want to think for themselves, and it's a terrible system. That's all I can say. But I'll say one last thing before we wrap up about Venezuela. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I do think that if Maduro, if there were some incentives that maybe we could create in the United States for him to get out of Venezuela, I think maybe that's the best way to go. I hope I'm not being optimistic,
Well,
but that would be the best.
if he has had Cuban advisors all the time. Chavez, his predecessor, had Cuban advisors. The Castro family and the members of the military junta that rule Cuba, they all have bank accounts overseas. They have all stashed away um, huge sums of money. So much so that now I can't remember which of the business magazines it is that lists the richest people in the world. Uh, for many years running, had the Castro family on the list because
I
of
think
their.
it's called Castro Inc. Isn't that
Yes,
what they call
that's
it?
what I call it,
Yeah,
Castro Inc. It's
yeah, that's what. I don't know whether that was from one of your articles or another one that I saw,
no,
but it's called. It's this this incredible enterprise. The great socialists enjoy this great capitalist enterprise. Isn't that funny?
yeah. So I'm sure Maduro has money stashed away in very secure places, including Switzerland. And if he's granted immunity and he can go live in exile somewhere else, he's comfortable. He'll be fine. Um, the same applies to all these Latin American dictators. I'm sure that Ortega in Nicaragua has money stashed away somewhere, and the Castros certainly do. I very recently ran into an article about Mariela Castro, that's Raul's daughter, so Fidel's niece. buying a multi-million-dollar house in Florence, Italy. So that's, it's George Orwell's Animal Farm.
That's right. Well, I just thought it was funny. I think it was Alberto or maybe you who published a post here in the last day or so of Diaz-Canel wearing a Rolex.
A Rolex, yeah.
Was that you or Alberto?
No, that was Alberto. Was that like a $10,000 or $30,000 Rolex? It was just obscenely expensive.
Yeah,
right?
And you remember when they took, I think Alberto put this video too, a few months ago when they went to Italy and they were eating at these expensive Italian restaurants and, running around as these great diplomats. I mean, these are nothing but, street dictators, and yet they certainly love the life, don't they?
Yeah. What amuses me and irritates me to no end, so simultaneously I'm amused and irritated, is that, in the world's press, all of these military juntas and all of these right-wing dictators in Latin America, they're evil, right? But all these left-wing military juntas and military dictatorships, they're okay, just simply because they're on the left side of the political spectrum. But they rule the same way, they commit the same kinds of crimes, they repress people, perhaps even more forcefully, and they're stashing away money.
Right.
It's
No, I agree 100% with you. I get frustrated the same way as you do with that. It reminds me of a line that my late mother once said, de que Castro ha hecho un santo de Batista. Because, for all the accusations of Batista stealing money, I'm sure he did, but I guarantee you that he didn't do as much. Because for all of his dictatorship, Batista never controlled the Cuban economy the way Castro does.
That's right.
So there's no way he had access to as much money. I mean, Castro literally owns the island, including a couple of homes in Miramar that he took from my father's uncle. So I know that at least he's got those two that he stole and gave them to his his people.
I lived 2 or 3 blocks from Che Guevara's mansion. He took over this mansion. It was either like half of an entire city block, or maybe it was the whole block. It was immense. It had a gate in front and was completely fenced off. It was almost like an embassy. That was Che Guevara's home, which was taken from somebody. That's just the way it works.
That's the way it works. I mean, I talk to people who go to Cuba and they talk about how beautiful Miramar is. And it was, I guess, as I remember as a little boy going out to Miramar, that beautiful part of Havana. And, people say, oh, it's so beautiful, these beautiful homes.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, homes that were stolen from the people who probably live in Miami now. And that's part of the way they do things. Carlos, I want to thank you so much. I hope we get to do this again, because I can tell that we can probably do this for a whole hour.
Sure.
But I want to thank you so much for joining us and giving us your input and your wisdom, as always. And you look real good in that red shirt.
Thanks for the invitation. The reason I'm wearing this,
yes,
that my thermostat is not working.
Oh, okay.
So it's actually like warm outside. Well, you're in Houston, so it's
Dallas. We're in Dallas area. We have 104 today. So
oh my God! But anyway,
we are 104. And it's going to be like that for several days. So this is, I always joke about this, and I say that this is global warming week in North Texas. This is global warming week. If anybody wants to make a case that the world is getting warmer, this week you can make that point.
Yes. But anyway, my thermostat is not working. I've got my home temperature set to like 75, 77. But I can't turn the air conditioner off. But if I turn it off, then I roast.
Right. Yeah. Well, here we have the same problem. The machine is running constantly. You keep hoping that it doesn't burn out, because it's just running constantly because of the heat. But Carlos, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank
And
you,
I really
Romeo.
thank you for your time and your input. And let's do it again and keep up the great work at Babalu that all your contributions are always so great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Our good friend, Carlos Eire, professor and great friend. There we go. There you go. Great friend of our show and great friend of over the years that we've developed a friendship and of course now connected through Babalu, where we see each other every day with our different posts that we do there. But thank you for listening. I know we'll be posting this on Babalu, so if you have a chance to comment on it, please do. I'm sure Carlos and I would enjoy reading your comments. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night from Dallas, Texas.